Russian-Chinese relations can become an effective weapon against Western sanctions. The tension between Russia and NATO over Ukraine worries many countries, including those outside the Euro-Atlantic region. For example, what is happening is being closely watched in China, where they have already unequivocally expressed their support for Moscow. At the same time, the PRC will almost certainly remain on the sidelines of the military-political aspect in this crisis, but may play an important role in the possible economic consequences. In late January, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, during his conversation with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, urged the US authorities to take Russia's security concerns seriously and take them into account. Regional security cannot be ensured by strengthening and even expanding military alliances, the minister said, calling Russia's concerns rational. The situation in Ukraine cannot but worry China. Beijing is closely following the Ukrainian issue, as it, like Moscow, has a difficult relationship with the West. Especially from the USA. The anti-Chinese vector, which was set by the 45th American President Donald Trump, was also picked up by the current leader Joe Biden. In Washington, China and Russia are officially called the main challenges for the United States, which means that pressure on Moscow will certainly be followed by pressure on Beijing. Moreover, China still has an unresolved issue with Taiwan. Just like Ukraine, this semi-autonomous island has been getting more and more American weapons lately. How NATO handles the situation with Ukraine will tell Beijing a lot about what to expect in the event of an escalation around Taiwan or in the South China Sea. In addition, Ukraine is a country where China has its own interests. For example, the Chinese Global Initiative, One Belt, One Road, includes the Ukrainian commercial port of Chornomorsk. China consistently remains the largest trading partner of Ukraine, and Kiev is the largest supplier of grain to China. By 2025, the parties plan to increase bilateral trade from $15.7 billion to $20 billion a year. In addition, China has invested in various Ukrainian infrastructure projects, including a new Kiev metro line. The current crisis threatens to turn into sanctions for Russia despite the fact that in Russia and even in Ukraine they say that neither side is interested in an escalation of the conflict. In the West they continue to report a constant militaristic threat. Moreover, Washington, London and Brussels are actively working on new anti-Russian sanctions. They are promised to be used if Russia starts hostilities. However, there is no guarantee that they will not be introduced for some other reason. Or for no reason at all. Earlier, the chairman of the US Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs of the US Congress, Robert Menendez, Democrat from New Jersey, said that some of the sanctions discussed in the US Senate against the Russian Federation due to the situation in Ukraine could be introduced even if the invasion constantly announced in the West does not take place. Washington is not talking about specific measures, but judging by the initiatives of American lawmakers, they can seriously affect the economy not only of Russia, but of the whole world. Possible restrictions relate to the banking and financial sectors, dollar conversion, which may lead to a fall in the stock market of the Russian Federation. The restrictions may include a ban on the export of raw materials and weapons, which will seriously affect the Russian economy. The discussed ban on the export of American high-tech products to Russia may leave the country's citizens even without some models of smartphones, tablets and TVs. Experts warn that all this threatens with different consequences, from rising food and clothing prices to disruptions in pension payments due to the collapse of the ruble and Russian markets. Given the close ties between Russia and China, sanctions will become a problem for Beijing as well. In recent years, Russia and China continue to develop relations within the framework of the 2001 Treaty of Good Neighborliness, Friendship and Cooperation. They concern many areas, including military cooperation. Chinese President Xi Jinping spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin more than any other foreign leader last year. The Russian president himself called the relations between the two countries a model of cooperation in the 21st century. The last impetus for an even greater rapprochement of Russian-Chinese positions was the events of 2014, when the West began to impose the first sanctions against Russia due to reunification with Crimea and the escalation of the conflict in southeastern Ukraine. Back then, Western restrictions on Moscow didn't bother Beijing too much, but economic relations have deepened since then. The countries cooperate in the field of aerospace technologies, oil and gas industry, chemistry and aircraft industry. Chinese state-owned companies are investing in Russian energy assets. At the same time, there is a dynamic development of Chinese-Russian cooperation in the field of e-commerce. Volume of trade between Russia and China. If the West succeeds in causing significant harm to Russia through sanctions, then in the event of a crisis in the Asian region, they will be able to use the same leverage against China. But if China helps Russia mitigate the effects of these sanctions, the US will lose an important tool of economic pressure on Beijing, the FPRI study says. Countering the sanctions could be a sharp transition of Russian-Chinese trade to alternative payment systems. We are switching to national currencies. We will not completely switch. Maybe this sanctions will somewhat speed up the process, Russian ambassador to China Andrei Denisov told TASS. According to him, various twists and turns in the sanctions cases will in no way hinder the development of Russian-Chinese trade and economic relations. In addition, both Moscow and Beijing have spent a lot of money on developing their own payment systems, but so far there has been no chance to test them in a real crisis. If this mechanism works, then it can also be used in trade with third countries, bypassing as sanctions. This also applies to possible export restrictions. The United States also announced a possible restriction on the supply of semiconductors to Russia. This could cut off Russians' access to some of the most advanced smartphones and tablets that contain American components. Most of these devices are either assembled in China or manufactured by Chinese firms. Possible US export controls on these models would also leave Chinese companies with the question of whether to comply with US export restrictions or find a way around them. The PRC government may strongly reject export controls. If so, then the US will have to choose between turning a blind eye to this gap or escalating and starting to punish Chinese firms for violations, said FPRI expert Chris Miller, pointing out that otherwise China looks like a country that produces technology and sells it only with the permission of Washington. Miller also writes that China may assist in the creation of shell companies through which it will continue to supply smartphones to Russia. Thus, China will protect manufacturers and assemblers of smartphones from US sanctions. Although even in this case, the United States will be able to respond to such actions. Be that as it may, neither Beijing nor Russia is interested in an escalation in Ukraine, since both countries have their own interests in the region. However, if the West really decides on the sanctions promised against Russia, then it will be difficult for China to maintain an underlined neutrality, at least in matters of observing economic interaction with Moscow.